How bad is lead for the environment? So the tricky part with lead and firearms is, unfortunately, it kind of gets political, but I'm going to stay apolitical on this. For example, everybody on the left will say firearms are bad. If you get rid of lead, it makes shooting firearms more expensive, therefore lead bad, therefore lead should be banned. Where people on the right are more like, no, lead is good for all fire applications, lead should not be banned anywhere. Where in all honesty, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Just like with most things, you can't take extreme of one side or the other. So today I'm going to use some data to show you where that answer lies, and then I'm also going to link some studies down below that support these claims. I use Google Gemini a little bit to help discuss these kind of points and to help me find some studies related to the topic. I will put a link to that whole transcript in the description below, so if you want to go read through and discuss. And I even act as somebody kind of skeptical of lead, and at the end of the day, Google Gemini also said, hey, you know, lead really isn't that bad in most applications, but there are some places where it should be banned. Okay, so let's first talk about how lead affects the environment. So lead is a heavy metal and is pretty much bad for every living thing. I'm going to do a whole nother video on how lead affects a human body and development and neurological functions and all that. That's kind of a discussion for a different day. But lead in your body is bad, whether it gets into your body slowly or whether it gets whether you get a case of rapid onset lead poisoning from high velocity projectiles. Either way, lead in your body, bad. And that applies to all animals, really. So you want to keep lead out of your body. So lead in the environment, if it gets eaten by an animal, but they did some research that even grasses that grow in an area like where a range is at tend to have orders of magnitude greater lead content in them than grasses that grow outside of a range where there's going to be high lead content. And so therefore animals that eat those grasses will then also ingest more lead and can show signs of lead poisoning as well. So lead in your body is not good. So now when it gets into the environment, how does it get in your body? What kind of affects that? And there's a ton of variables that go into that. Some of them are soil pH, your soil content, like how is it more clay or is it more silty? What does the dissolved minerals in the water look like? Like, do you have hard water? Do you have lots of minerals dissolved in that water already? Is your range near, like, what is the water table like? Is that nearby? Whether or not the lead stays where it's shot or whether it goes and washes downstream and then affects other things. So it's important to understand that lead in and of itself is not water soluble. It has to oxidize into different compounds in order to be water soluble and then be taken downstream in any river or such. Now, even in those water soluble compounds, it is still very dense, and so it does tend to sink to the bottom, or when a river slows down, it'll settle to the bottom. So it's often that even water downstream of a range won't tend to carry a lot of that lead dissolved in it for very long, simply because it's so dense, more dense than any other silt around it, and it's just going to sink to the bottom very quickly, even when it's in a compound that will dissolve in water. Lead measurements in land is measured in milligrams per kilogram. Now, typical background, if you go get a shovel of dirt, there's going to be some amount of lead typically in the environment here in the United States. Typical lead levels in your soil range to about 10 to 30 milligrams per kilogram. Now, the EPA says if you have more than 400 milligrams per kilogram in your soil when you're doing construction or anything like that, then you have to remediate it. Now, lead levels at ranges will often be 10 to hundreds, and in some extreme cases even 1,000 times more lead than what the EPA recommends as that cutoff. It's also important to note that lead, when it's in a specific area, will stay there for millennia. It has a soil half-life of well over 1,000 years. From all these studies and research, lead in certain instances can travel and pollute the environment and then affect wildlife and such. In fact, lead, if you're into hunting waterfowl or anything like that, you will know that you can't use lead shot in order to go hunt those. You have to use steel. And they did some research, and before the 1991 ban on it, they estimate anywhere from 1.5 to about 2 million birds every year died because of lead poisoning. Now that lead shot is banned, those numbers have come way down and it's much better. So yeah, I would actually agree that banning lead in certain aspects, especially in certain hunting aspects, it was actually a good thing, especially in the waterfowl case. Now, there's other cases where hunting with lead is going to be totally fine and it's not a big deal, especially where you're harvesting the meat, and in those cases hunting with leaded ammunition is not going to be that big a deal. Kind of all the bad news, the doom and gloom. I'm making it probably sound like I'm a lefty now and I want to ban lead, and that is absolutely not the case. I have hundreds of pounds of lead right here, both casting and projectiles that I'm planning on going shooting in the range. I've personally left hundreds of pounds of lead in these ranges, and as an anecdotal case, all my friends' kids are fine, my kids are fine. They swim in the local, you know, rivers and streams, and we got a reservoir nearby that we'll go swim in, and everybody's fine locally. The lead water levels are completely fine where I'm at, yet the community where I'm at is very gun friendly, and if you go into a lot of these canyons and these mountains nearby, it is not uncommon to hear gunshots. I know that there are tons and tons of lead left in these mountains every year from people shooting like crazy, yet everything down here seems fine, so that's interesting. And so in the specific area where I'm at, or really in a lot of the Rocky Mountains in general, just due to the rock makeup, the soil is not, the soils out here have an alkalinity level of about 8, so that means they're not acidic, so that's gonna keep things staying put. So here in the Rocky Mountains, the nice thing is pretty much all of the variables that make lead moved, we don't have. In fact, pretty much every variable, depending on where you live in the Rocky Mountains, is stacked in our favor, so that lead shot in mountainous ranges or public gun ranges, when it's shot, it's going to stay there. It's not going to dissolve. It's just going to stay put, which is fantastic news, which means go to the range, shoot all day long. The water around here in the Rocky Mountains is very hard, so that's going to contribute to lead not being able to get dissolved in the water and flow downstream, which is fantastic. Even the rock type in many of the Rocky Mountains, it's going to be like a limestone or dolomite rock. It has a neutralizing effect, and so it's not going to combine with the lead and flow that downstream. And then even the type of soil in the environment in most of the Rocky Mountains is also going to help contribute to the lead staying put. So pretty much like all the variables that you would be concerned of, like there's not even one of them that's like, oh no, that adds a heightened risk. And so shooting lead, at least where I'm at here in the Rocky Mountains, into the mountains, it's going to go there and it's going to stay there. It's not going to wash downstream, which is really good news. In fact, I'm going to do a follow-up video on this spring when it warms up. A dozen gun ranges in like a 3-mile section of the small canyon, and there's a stream. So I'm going to go take water samples at the bottom of the stream and then at the top of the stream during the spring runoff, and so that way, if that's kind of the worst case time of year for lead to be washing into the stream, and we're just going to see, hey, what do the lead water levels look like? So here's even what AI had to say about the lead in these local ranges. It said, the lead at local ranges is likely staying exactly where it was fired. Unless the soil is physically moved or someone is breathing in dust directly at the berm, the hard data suggests it is chemically locked by the limestone-rich environment of the mountains. So the TLDR, or too long didn't watch, of this whole thing is lead in certain hunting environments or in areas where there's lots of water, high acidity soil, there's not many minerals in the soil that can chemically lock in the lead. In those areas, you got to be really careful with your lead management plan, or just ban the lead in hunting out in the wild, especially in kind of water environments in general. But in many cases here in the United States, especially here in the Rockies, where we have limestone, we got calcium and phosphates dissolved in the water, and then the soil, based on the soil type and the soil pH, it's fine to shoot lead a lot into the mountains and you're not going to run into problems. Anyway guys, if you have any thoughts or comments or questions, please put in the comments section below. As always guys, thanks for watching. See you on the next one.